All right, this is it, y'all. You get what you get. I'm not filming this one again. Think it's gonna work this time? Hello! Welcome back to my bedroom. Thank you for coming back. My name is Keisha, and today we are going to be talking about what is addiction. First off, I just want to say thank you for watching my first video. I know it was cringy with the editing, and there was I think the music was a little too loud, and there's a couple of other things, but we will figure this out. It will get better. Again, just a reminder, I'm not a medical professional. I don't have any formal training in addictions, but I do have a lot of experience, and I've been doing some research as well. So this isn't just coming from nowhere, but I do recommend that you do your own research, look into the sources that I cite in the description and all that jazz too. Again, I really appreciate you watching, so let's get into talking about what is addiction. So my first question for you is, when you hear the word addiction or you hear the word addict, what comes to mind? Who are you picturing? What stereotypes do you hold? What picture comes to mind when you hear the word addict versus person with addiction, or alcoholic versus struggling with alcohol abuse? How would you approach somebody differently if you thought that they were attention seeking versus support seeking? When talking about addiction, are we talking about a compulsion towards certain behaviors, or are we talking about a physical dependency to certain substances? Language is incredibly powerful in shaping beliefs, values, and approaches to certain things. The way that we choose to speak about certain things affects the way that we experience them. Words and phrases can reinforce harmful stereotypes and actually derail recovery for a lot of people. When you call someone in recovery clean, what you're implying is that people who are in active addiction are dirty, or that somebody who is struggling with substance abuse is in some way flawed. When you tell somebody who's struggling with addiction that they are going to be struggling with this disease their whole life, it takes away their motivation and it takes away their reasoning to do it, and it derails recovery. All of these things are really harmful for recovering addicts, and they can create fear and they can create panic. And what it does is it reinforces negative stereotypes and derails recovery. Addiction is complicated, and language can help shape public opinion and ideas and policies around it. So there are a couple of things that it's important to remember, and even though it might seem annoying and repetitive, one of the more important things is using person-first language. And this is something that I even still struggle with. Just remembering to say person with an addiction or person struggling with substance abuse, rather than labeling them as an addict or an alcoholic. The reason this is so important is because we tend to forget around marginalized people that they are more than just the identity that makes them marginalized. This goes for people of color, people who identify as LGBT, and also people who are addicts. That label becomes what they identify as, which can lead to so many people becoming informed about who they are from wrong or harmful stereotypes, and them having to fight back against what those stereotypes are. It's also important to use the medical terms for things like relapse and sobriety, because that reinforces positive work and improvement rather than negative slip-ups or mistakes. I also want to make a quick note on humor, because what we're talking about is heavy and serious stuff. Humor is important to deal with things like that. Levity and light and joy is needed to be able to cope with the traumas and the mistakes and the heaviness that comes with substance abuse. But I'm not necessarily like the most naturally funny person, and I can't really, I'm not a comedian, so I encourage you to make jokes in the comments and make it a bright space if we can. Okay, so what is addiction? There are generally two arguments around what addiction is, and they fall under either it being a medical, physical disease or disorder, and it being a moral failing, a character flaw, and self-interest and self-pleasure. So the debate on this hand is that addiction is a medical illness that physically alters the brain's neural pathways and affects chemicals in the brain like dopamine and serotonin that can alter personality, alter behavior, and is a medical issue. So I found two definitions online that I want to read to you verbatim from the site. The first one is from the American Psychiatric Association. And what they say is that addiction is a complex condition, a brain disease that is manifested by compulsive substance use despite harmful consequences. People with addictions, or severe substance use disorder, have an intense focus on using a certain substance, such as alcohol or drugs, to the point that it takes over their life. They keep using alcohol or a drug even when they know it will cause problems. Yet a number of effective treatments are available and people can recover from addiction and lead normal, productive lives. They go on in the second paragraph to talk about how there is changes in the brain's rewiring that can increase cravings and certain judgment and behavior, and etc. So the second definition that I'm going to read from you is from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. It's drugabuse.gov. And their definition says, addiction is defined as a chronic relapsing disorder characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite adverse consequences. It is considered a brain disorder because it involves functional changes to brain circuits involved in reward, stress, and self-control, and those changes may last a long time after a person has stopped taking drugs. So, if we break that down, both of those definitions have said that addiction is a brain disorder that affects the brain's wiring and changes a person's behavior and personality. Addiction often goes hand in hand with mental health in what is called concurring disorders. Addiction in the medical world is defined by consistent use, cravings, interference with life, tolerance buildup, and withdrawals. It's often described on a spectrum from low-risk use and experimentation to moderate to medium use to extreme substance abuse behaviors. And that's the end where addiction lies. The medical definition argues that after a certain point of use, the user loses their ability to self-control and to moderate their substance use. On the moral argument side, a lot of people will argue that addiction or alcoholism is a character flaw or a moral failing. What they see is the user has decided or made a decision to use whatever substance they choose for the sake of their own pleasure, their own selfishness, and that they have no regard for the harm of others. They often use words such as self-seeking, weak, self-important, and others along those lines. People who think addiction is a moral flaw often look at addicts as weak or as selfish or self-centered. And the moral definition puts the onus on the user to have the responsibility for all of their actions and to be able to recover on their own. In my experience, I saw Alcoholics Anonymous members tend to lean towards the medical, this is a disease, because it gives them purpose to stay in the meetings. If you believe that you are always going to be an alcoholic or an addict because this is a disease that you have and something genetically different with you, it takes the ownership of your actions away from you and puts it onto this disorder that you may have. Alcoholics Anonymous also likes to promote that you will need to attend the meetings for the rest of your life and that it's a lifelong commitment to the group. And that fits well with the idea that you medically will always have a disorder. On the flip side of that, the people that I see tend to argue the moral definition are people who have experienced addiction and gotten sober in their own right without the assistance of a rehab or a spiritual fellowship. Both of those definitions of addiction address active addiction, but neither really address how addiction happens. The argument of how addiction occurs is likely one you've already heard about before, which is nature versus nurture. This is often talked about around personality traits or quirks that we pick up from our parents when we're younger, but it's rarely really talked about in terms of who becomes an addict. There's a lot of evidence to show that genetics plays for about half of the susceptibility that you might have to becoming a person with addiction. And having a family history with addicts also increases the likelihood that you may become an addict. Genetics are also often responsible for the reaction somebody has to certain stimulus. So, for example, whether you like the feeling of something or if you're likely to seek out repeat experiences. It can't be ignored that situational circumstances also increase the likelihood for addiction to develop. Someone who is growing up with exposure to certain substances at a young age, for example, is far likelier to experiment at a younger age and therefore develop an addiction. Addiction is often a symptom of misplaced coping mechanisms for unresolved traumas. And those unresolved traumas usually happen younger than we're able to realize or process. It's easy to see just how significant environment and circumstance are to risk reduction when we understand how addiction develops in somebody. I'll link this TED Talk that illustrated it very well in the description below, but he basically talked about how we increase our tolerance to sugar, and so when we don't have enough sugar, our body craves it even though naturally we don't need as high amount as we're eating. He takes it through all of the steps of introduction and excitement to tolerance buildup to cravings to withdrawal symptoms. And it's just on sugar. When you understand how the brain is working to avoid pain and maximize pleasure, it's easy to see how this could happen to anybody and pretty easily go unnoticed. So, what do I think about all of this? Personally, I think addiction and recovery is really personal and really complicated and has a lot of nuance. I also think that nuance is something that we're lacking a lot of in conversation right now in our society. And when you're talking about addiction, you can't ignore that everybody's story is going to be different. I think when it comes to the medical versus moral debate, it's a pretty gray area and it's more of a Venn diagram than one or the other. I do understand at a very personal level that addiction, especially when you're deep in it, will alter your brain, will alter your thoughts, will alter your personality, and will make you do things that you would never, as a person who is sober, even think of doing. I do personally believe, though, that this idea that it is a long-term, lifetime disease is propagated really to discourage people from recovering and to entice people into fellowships like Alcoholics Anonymous instead of medical recovery. I think once you have that first step at recovery, whether it's medically assisted or not, following up and finishing your recovery and pushing for your recovery, that is a choice. It is a choice when you're sober to put something in your body. I don't think that that's morally bad or selfish. I think it's complicated. There's a ton of reasons people get into substance use. There's not enough education or support out there, and there's definitely not enough research being done. I think it's complicated. I don't think people are broken. I think the way that we handle it is. And I think if you approach somebody who's struggling with compassion and with empathy and with an open mind to want to understand and to listen and learn, it might go farther than you think it will. I think there's an embarrassing lack of public education around substance abuse, around alcoholism, around recovery. And I think with that education, people would be more willing to approach their friends who are struggling. People would be more willing to talk about it when they're in recovery. But that starts with changing our language, changing our ideas of the stereotypes and the stigmas. And it also has to start with us changing our obsession around alcohol. So my next video is going to be talking about the obsession that our society has with alcohol and drinking, and the drinking culture that we're all heavily ingrained in, and what recovery looks like in that. I'm going to talk about the glorification and idealizing of alcohol, but then exactly on the flip side of that, the stigmatization of people with addiction. So look forward to that video. Do all the things. You've been on YouTube longer than I have, so you know what to do. Share it out. I don't have a lot of social media, so send this to people, and I will see you next time. Bye. These two are really highly debated, and you often find people on one side or the other. It can't be ignored that situational circumstances also increase the likelihood for addiction to... Motherfucker. It can't be ignored